Social murder is a term that was used famously by a German guy called Friedrich Engels. One of his more famous works was a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England, and he wrote it when he was living in Manchester in the 19th century at the kind of height of the Industrial Revolution. He used this term in relation to the horrible living conditions and the horrible working conditions that were prevalent at the time. People were dying at an astonishing rate. Child mortality levels were appallingly high. And he was using that term social murder, particularly aimed at the private landlords who were making money out of people living in these horrible conditions and the factory owners, but also more broadly at those in society with power that allowed those conditions to persist. The expression social murder has since been used in lots of contexts. So it's been used in relation to the Grenfell fire, for example. It's been used in relation to different aspects of health inequalities, and that brings us back to austerity, because austerity policies were a political choice made for particular reasons that have harmed the population. But the bottom line is, it doesn't really matter how you want to describe it. It's a politically created tragedy on an enormous scale, and it requires a political response.
Hello, David Walsh, Senior Lecturer at Glasgow University in Health Inequalities. Welcome along to Cala Corner.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No worries. David, I had seen a clip you'd went viral, probably, I suppose would be.
I don't think I've ever gone viral.
No, I can assure you. There must have been some Australian news company were doing a thing on the sort of drop in life expectancy in the UK, and you appeared basically, and I sort of contacted you off the back of that. So that was the kind of backstory, and you've recently co-authored a book, I think is the term, titled, quite emotively titled, Social Murder. So you can tell us a wee bit about the title first, and then we'll go for them, mate.
Sure. So the full title is Social Murder, Austerity and Life Expectancy in the UK. So it's about the impact of austerity policies. And we'll come on to this, I think, but it's hard to overstate what the impact has been in terms of mortality rates, death rates, widening health inequalities in the UK in the last 14 years. So if I had visual prompts like I might have in a presentation or a lecture theatre, I could show you graphs, and I could show you death rates, for example, which have come down decade after decade after decade after decade, okay? Because that's like life expectancy goes up and up and up, which reflects, over the past 100 years, it reflects all sorts of societal improvements, okay? So medical advances, public health advances, better living conditions, all the rest. You look back over 100 years, the only times that's not improved has been times of like profound crisis in society, so world wars or pandemics, okay? But in the early 2010s, a couple of years after austerity policies were introduced, overall life expectancy stopped improving, mortality rate stopped improving. But in the poorer parts, everywhere in the UK, things went into reverse. So mortality rates that were coming down in poorer areas just stopped and went into reverse. So what that meant was that people were dying younger and in increasing numbers. And in a wealthy society like this just should never happen. So the book is about all the evidence of what caused that. And in large part, the principal driver was austerity policies, which include cuts to, basically, austerity can be defined in lots of complex ways, okay? But fundamentally, it was about cuts to government funding, which impact on really key services that people need in society, all of us, you, me, everybody, and also massive cuts to social security. And social security in a civilised society like the UK, Scotland, England is a safety net for people to turn to in difficult circumstances. The scale of the cuts just meant that safety net was taken away, and the result is that people have died on a huge scale. And I know I'm rambling now, but I'll come back to your question about the title of the book because it's all relevant to this. So one of the studies we did looked at what should have happened to mortality rates across the UK if previous trends going back decades had continued, and what did happen, and what that difference was. And the difference of that was across the UK, hundreds of thousands of deaths, like more people that died from COVID. Okay, so this is on that kind of scale. Anyway, to come back to that's all relevant to the answer to the question. We didn't come up with the term social murder, okay? Social murder is a term that was used famously by a German guy called Friedrich Engels, who was a German philosopher, social scientist, author, and many more things. If you Google him, he was also at the forefront of the hipster beard. He's got an incredible beard. But anyway, one of his more famous works was a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England, and he wrote it when he was living in Manchester in the 19th century at the kind of height of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, if you imagine what conditions were like in that city at that time, and he used this term in relation to the horrible living conditions and the horrible working conditions in the factories and all that were prevalent at the time. Because they led basically to dying conditions. People were dying at an astonishing rate. Child mortality levels were appallingly high. And he was using that term social murder, particularly aimed at the private landlords who are making money out of people living in these horrible, horrible conditions, and the factory owners. But also more broadly at those in society with power that allowed those conditions to persist. Okay, so in that more general sense of people in power who make decisions which cause harm to people, the expression social murder has since been used in lots of contexts. So it's been used in relation to the Grenfell fire, for example, and the decisions around that which led to the deaths of people. It's been used in terms of the COVID pandemic, in terms of how governments responded to that or didn't respond to that. And you can point to lots of different countries where the responses weren't exactly exemplary. It's been used in relation to different aspects of health inequalities, and that brings us back to austerity, because austerity policies were a political choice made for particular reasons that have harmed the population. So in the book, we lay out all the evidence for that in quite a lot of detail, and then just ask the question, how would you describe this? Is this what Engels referred to as social murder? But the bottom line is, it doesn't really matter how you want to describe it. It's a politically created tragedy on an enormous scale, and it requires a political response. And the whole point of doing the book is to try and bring that evidence to a bigger audience, particularly politicians, because we've had lots of conversations over the last few years, and I've been quite struck by how ignorant a lot of politicians are of all this data and evidence. So that's why I've written the book, which is a very, very long answer to quite a short question.
Hopefully would the answers will get shorter as we go on here, David? Nah, only joking. So I actually read the book just recently, as I sort of said today. I actually finished it today, and I enjoyed the book. So fair play to you for writing it, and I think that's one of the reasons why I contacted you as well, because this kind of whatever, I don't like to say it's a story. The data surprised me. It was something that I was shocked it wasn't sort of in the public consciousness. So that's why I want to talk about it, to see how we can become sort of more active citizens and start sort of talking about this. Yeah. So when did the idea for the book come about? Like, because you're saying the data came out in sort of 2010, 2012. Did you sort of start to see this trend where life expectancy starts to reverse rather than increase as it had done for so long? So when did the idea sort of, you go, I'm going to actually write about this?
So we've been doing a lot of studies on this. So I mentioned that paper that kind of quantified the number of deaths, for example. There's been a lot of other studies done, some by us, but by lots and lots of other people. And that's actually quite an important point, because there's been a lot of people doing a lot of work in different parts of the UK and different parts of the world, using different data sets and different methods, and they all point to the same thing of how these policies have harmed people. And actually it was Jerry, my co-author, Jerry McCartney, who came up with the idea of a book. Jerry's the kind of guy that, you know, enjoys working on Sunday mornings, Sunday afternoons, Sunday evenings. So Jerry obviously wasn't busy enough, and he suggested the idea of a book, and then we had a conversation about what the format of the book would be. And we came up with a book that wasn't just about the evidence, but which was interspersed, as you'll have seen if you've read it, with kind of stories of individuals who were affected by different aspects of the policies, to try and make it a bit more accessible. I mean, it is an academic book. We work in the university, so we're academics, you know, by definition, but we were trying not to create an academic book that would bore people to tears. It was one that would try and present the evidence, but also explain how these policies have impacted on people. So we've mixed it up with kind of these individual stories. But yeah, it was Jerry's idea, so I blame him for how busy things have been. No,
that was the most powerful part of the book for me, to be honest, with some of the sort of testimonies. Yeah. So was there something, like, how did you find those stories effectively? Was there something that triggered maybe you or Jerry into, like, with this, you know, we definitely need to publish this sort of thing?
So what we tried to do was to get different stories that were reflective of different aspects of the austerity policies. So there are 7 individual stories kind of woven throughout the book, which capture those different facets. So there's one about, for example, the impact of the bedroom tax in England. There's one about...
Can we talk about that one specifically?
Like, can come back to it, if that's all right. Just because otherwise I'll forget what I'm about to say. So there's one about the bedroom tax in England. There's one about the impact of cuts to social care. There's one about impact to housing benefits. There's one about the really pernicious impacts of sanctions. This is where basically people are, inverted commas, sanctioned, a horrible word in itself, but punished by the state for not doing what the state thinks to receive benefits. And the one about the impact on mental health, a horrible story. One about the impact on people who use drugs. So there are different examples, but the idea was to try and illustrate these different aspects of austerity. How we found them? Well, basically, we signed a contract with the publishers in the summer of last year, and we had to deliver the first full manuscript on the 1st of December, so we had to find examples relatively quickly. So 4 of the stories are ones that actually were featured in the media, but we got in touch with the journalists who put us in touch with their families and asked their permission to use the stories, and then got a bit more information about the stories from their families. 2 are ones that were used in a book by Frances Ryan, who writes for The Guardian, and she allowed us to use those stories because they were quite important ones about the impact of particular cuts to services. Another one was somebody who uses drugs, and we anonymised that story, but we spoke to the kind of caseworkers and the social workers around that, because her story was very typical of a lot of people who already had huge problems, huge vulnerabilities, but were just made unimaginably worse by these policies that were introduced from 2010 onwards.
Aye, no, fair enough. The reason I was asking about the bedroom tax one, because I found that particularly moving myself, to be honest. So
people may or may not remember. So the bedroom tax was this tax that was, it had I'm trying to remember the official name the government gave it. It wasn't the bedroom tax, they didn't like that. But basically it was if you were on social security benefits and you had an additional bedroom in your house, then your social security got cut a lot. Now, in one level, people might say, well, if people have got a house that's big enough to have an extra bedroom, maybe that's right. But actually, the reality was people on social security are already in poverty by definition. That's why they're getting some kind of help from the state. They may or may not have another bedroom in the house, but that's kind of immaterial to a degree, especially when you look at the fact that it's not that in lots of areas of the UK there were just lots of other available houses to move to and overcome that problem. So by no fault of their own, their money was just cut, and there wasn't a great deal they could do about it. Worth just pointing out that in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, the devolved governments actually mitigated it. So they effectively, through different ways, reinstated the money that people lost through that. The end of the story of that was, I mean, without going into all the kind of horrible detail, it was just somebody. And again, a common theme of all these stories is that it's not about other people, just people who are, in financial difficulty. It's about, it could happen to anybody. That there are other stories as well about people who are just doing their normal life. They get into a bit of difficulty in life, and at that point when, for all of us in society, we should be able to get a bit of help when needed. They were not just ignored, but actually effectively turned on by the system, and everything was made worse. And in that particular example, it was a woman who took her own life because of the horrible situation she found herself in, with not having enough to live on. And she'd written a letter to the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, pointing this out. And I don't think she actually posted it, but it was just pointing out the sheer unfairness of the situation. And like a lot of people, she was driven to the point of just not being able to carry on. The other thing worth saying is when we were looking for these stories, I was absolutely astonished by all the stories that are out there. I mean, there are websites out there, for example, of people who were and are disabled with various kind of levels of disability, and part of the austerity process was that basically people were not believed when they said they weren't fit enough to work. So they had these work capability assessments. Anybody who knows anybody who's had some kind of disability will be aware of this process. But just hundreds and hundreds of just horrific stories of people who, again, should have been helped. In a civilised society, they would have been helped. And instead, they were told, no, you're fit for work, even when they clearly were not. And the consequences are absolutely horrendous. Absolutely horrendous.
I don't know if I'm confusing that story with another one, but I had thought that one of the when it talked about the bedroom tax was somebody in their family had committed suicide, and this is why they had an extra bedroom as well. Like that, like you're saying, there's just countless examples of like where there's just no care. There's no like an extra like process to say like there's extenuating circumstances here. You're not going to be.
And there's another story. Again, I'm not going to go into the details, but another story of somebody who, again, she was just a woman that had worked and looked after her family, but she was the victim of an assault, and basically, although she refused help from the state, until she was in her 50s and basically was just struggling. She had severe head injuries as a result of this assault, and she basically at that time in her life she turned to the state for help. But again, the same thing happened. There was the opposite happened, that she was kind of sucked into a system where her money was taken away, and it's just a horrible story. She died from cancer, but the point was, as her daughter put it very movingly, that the additional stress caused by all that hastened her death, basically, and time that they could have had together was taken away, is how her daughter phrased it. But the kind of postscript to all that was around that unfairness, is that the family had appealed. So this woman had lost her money because she couldn't attend an interview, but she couldn't attend an interview because she was deeply, deeply sick. And our family had appealed that, and the appeal was won. But by the time they got the money back, this woman had tragically passed away. But the family also took that further and made a complaint, and it went up the system to the relevant Conservative politician, who replied down the system that she was very, very happy with how the claim had been dealt with. So it's all that about wanting to live in a civilised world, where people who have needs and people need help get the help they need, rather than this kind of horrible, horrible system that is in place across the UK and is still in place across the UK. Because we might come to this later, but there's been an astonishing number of cuts to the social security system going back to 2010. Even though we now have a new UK government, not one of them has been reversed, and there's no talk of it being reversed. So we are still in this situation. Austerity still plays out today, affecting huge sections of the population. So it's massively, massively important, and it's massively tragic.
One of the things I wanted to recommend was, most people know about it anyway, but Daniel Blake kind of covers some of this, obviously. And it's just inhumane, like when you think about this story that you're talking about, for example, where it's a partner was domestically abusing her and actually tried to kill her. The worst thing imaginable that could really happen to somebody, and then to refuse or to try and work through that initially, and then everything that subsequently happened. That was a really powerful story as well, I thought, from the moral one. What about, you mentioned some of the other policies then, so I think is that the 2-child benefit gap has sort of been touted as one of the biggest policy disasters that's ever been implemented in sort of modern times in the UK. So touch on that.
Yeah, so this basically limits, if you have more than 2 children, then you get no more money effectively. So it impacts on bigger families, but bigger families who need help, again, they're not getting help. So it was described by one academic as emblematic of austerity in terms of its kind of pernicious reach, if you like, its pernicious impact. The point I'd make about that, though, is that one gets all the headlines at the moment because there's been a bit of a campaign to get the new UK Labour government to reverse it. And obviously that would be important that they do that, and everybody would want them to do it. But you have to understand, again, where that sits in the scale of all this. So for those that remember, when austerity was kicked off in 2010, it was the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government who had come to power. And in that first parliament, 2010, there was more than 150 separate reforms introduced to the social security system. So that's cutting people's money, cutting entitlement to that money on a massive, massive scale. And then that was followed by God knows how many in the subsequent 14 years. So although it's really important to say, yes, reverse the 2-child limit, that's not just the answer. The answer is they need to reverse what's been done to create a social security system that helps people. It's not about just 1 or 2 policies, although it would be great to reverse them. It's about understanding the scale and the totality of what's been done, and therefore the need and what's required to reverse all that.
I think one of the things that is touched on in the book, though, is like when people in your world, right, academics are producing these reports, like these are softening the language sometimes to sort of suit these policymakers. So how is that going to change? How are we going to change that so that we can actually have, a proper reform, a sort of welfare state?
Well, I suppose it comes back to what I was saying earlier about making people aware. I mean, there's no easy answer to this because we've been in different ways using different bits of evidence, shouting about this for a few years, and it's gone frankly nowhere. And we've had lots of conversations about this in terms of why there is that lack of awareness. Why, when we went through, for example, the Scottish Parliament, spoke to various people, why none of them were aware of the scale of these things, and in different meetings and presentations and God knows what, it gets into this discussion about whether that's our fault as researchers for not shouting about this in a kind of accessible, meaningful way, whether it's the media's fault for not carrying these stories, and I could say a little bit about that because some of that's been a bit weird. In the book we talk also more about particular organisations which have also helped that lack of awareness. So some of the kind of like big think tanks, the World Health Organization, Public Health England, who have all, for whatever reasons, kind of avoided a lot of the evidence around austerity. So that kind of lack of awareness is the big thing for me, which is again coming back to why we did the book, to try and take, have all this evidence in one place and then use this to try and shout about it in different areas, which is partly why I'm here talking with you about it, because using every possible opportunity to make people more aware of all this. Because as I say, at the heart of this is a lack of understanding of what's been going on.
Aye. Well, let's just presume that for the first 20 minutes we've got the message out there that life expectancy is like on the decline. Like, what if you had the ear of the policymakers down south and you sort of say tier one, like these are the most important things that you could do in the next sort of 3, 6, 12 months, 2 years, like what would some of those decisions be? So
there's a really important point about this, which is it's not rocket science and it's not a mystery. So that in the final chapter of the book, that's what we do. We lay out the policies that would be required. So I mean, at the heart, in terms of what's happened in the last 14 years, it's about reversing everything that's been done. So all the stuff I've just talked about in terms of reversing cuts to social security, creating a system that helps people rather than punishes them, investing in social services, public services, so that when people, all of us need help, we can get help. More broadly, we talk about, that if you're looking at all these graphs and charts and all the rest, the widening of health inequalities has been pretty dramatic in the last 14 years. I won't go into the details, but it's pretty extraordinary. So what do you do about that, as well as, reversing the last 14 years? Well, the evidence for what's required to address health inequalities is all out there as well, because, this stuff is everywhere. If you go to a public health conference, you can't, I said this in the book, I think, you can't throw a brick without hitting somebody who's presenting studies on health inequalities, and so the evidence about what works and what doesn't work is all there. So it's not that any politicians need to be given new information about what they should do. It's all there, but what it needs is political will. It needs a government that wants to do this. And at the moment, given that not a single social security reform is being touted as being reversed, there's no talk of this. And if you're going to really narrow health inequalities broadly, what you are talking about is making society more equal. So narrowing those, the gap between rich and poor more generally, because that we know would that have an impact on the gap in health terms as well. And that requires governments to want to do that. And the extent to which certainly the last governments over the last 14 years have not wanted to do that, the extent to which the new government would want to do that, it's hard to be terribly optimistic, I think.
But why are they getting away with that? I was trying to think about this earlier, right? I mean, you talk about the two child benefit gap, right, which is like a political hot potato at the moment, for wanting a sort of better term. Is it that politicians have got to the point where they know that even if you're no on benefits, people are really struggling, right? People who are no earning a lot of money, and they're maybe going, well, stop having more kids. That should be a personal choice. Some people are sort of supportive of this limit. Effectively, is that ultimately what this boils down to? This is not moving the needle in terms of what people are voting on. Is that ultimately what this is?
In terms of the last 14 years, obviously a lot of this has been ideological. So that the Conservative government, their position is reducing the role of the state. That opens up opportunities for private companies, privatisation of companies, all the rest. That's ideological. We don't really get into that in the book, really. It's more just about what the effects have been. But why those governments over the last 14 years did that, and it was done alongside, as we talk about in the book, a kind of vitriolic campaign of demonising the poorer sections of the population. So all these, headlines that you still get today around, skivers and scroungers and all this kind of nonsense touted by particular newspapers and all the rest, for which, people have studied this, and there's, these claims are completely baseless. Most people who are in receipt of Social Security are actually working. So the big increases in poverty have been people who are in work. So it's not that people are like not doing anything. It's just that the way things are set up, there's just not enough money to live on. So, as I say, it was accompanied by this kind of campaign of demonising people, which has been very successful. So if you look at, there are surveys, social attitude survey, it's a kind of big one where they ask people questions about things that are going on in society. And if you look at questions around people's views on people who are receiving Social Security, between 2010 and about 2019, they changed quite dramatically in terms of more people having a negative view because they're seeing these headlines about skivers and scroungers and all the rest of it. So in that sense, it was quite kind of successful. And it also allowed the Conservative government, I think, to do this more and more and more and more. And it even then impacted on what the opposition parties were saying at that time, because there are quotes from Rachel Reeves, who was the shadow chancellor, I think, at that time, talking about how no, Labour aren't the party of those on benefits either. So they were also kind of, it was like a race to the bottom of kind of crap, So there's this kind of narrative then that it's about, where this is allowed to happen, where you're allowed to kind of talk down to people who need help rather than give them help. So again, it's a rambling answer. Your question is, what language do we use? I think it's again about coming up with the evidence and trying to make people understand of the real pernicious impact all this has had on so many people's lives, I think. But
like that evidence is already there. Like I feel like that is.
It is there, but it's not. It's for whatever reason. I think. I mean, if you're being kind, and I will be kind about, for example, the politicians we spoke to, it's not that they knew all this and were pretending they didn't know it. They just didn't know it. You can point the finger to lots of people, advisors, God knows what, about why that's the case. But I don't think it's the case that they were willfully shutting it out. I think they just didn't know it. They should know it. They should have known it, and they should know it. And I suppose it's the job of us as researchers to try and make that evidence more accessible and available, and shout about this as much as we can. As I said a few times, that's what we're trying to do. But
we're talking about like the Conservatives a lot there, like Labour are being elected in the UK sort of level, and they are still not committed to reversing like that policy specifically. Yep. And I think there's different figures about how many Waynes will be lifted out of poverty, but certainly it seems to be broad consensus that reversing that would lift Waynes out of poverty. Like that is surely a fucking easy decision to make.
Absolutely. Well, it's not a question for me, it's a question for them, isn't it? And there's obviously frustration in that party because they've taken a particular line. There's been a lot of complaints within the party about it, but it's not a question for me, it's a question for them. Certainly, if you Private Eye run a little thing of, if you read Private Eye, a little thing called number crunching, where they contrast different numbers. And one of these numbers they were contrasting, I think just before Labour came into power, was the number of people at the Labour Party conference who were, I think, representing unions or representing community groups or whatever, and compared with the number of people representing big business groups, and how that had changed as the business world had realised Labour were coming to power. And so Labour are clearly taking actions that are business friendly, will we say, and that's kind of prioritised over what I would say they should be doing, obviously, in relation to helping the poor in society. In fact, beyond just the poor, helping society, because one of the things we also point out in the book is just how much society has changed over the last 14 years. And one example we give is food banks. I was doing a lecture or whatever the other day, and I was looking at the average age of people, and obviously students are quite young and everything, and I'm thinking actually they're probably unaware of a world where food banks weren't kind of normal. Do you know, you go into a supermarket, the food banks are there, they're everywhere, they're in soap operas, they're in whatever, books, whatever. Prior to 2010, they didn't exist, more or less. There was a paper done by people like Glasgow and Harriet Watt that kind of quantified this, to show prior to 2010, they were on the periphery of society. Now they're everywhere, and the figures are just incredible. So society's changed in really unimaginable ways over the last 14 years. And again, it's that need to make the new UK government understand. And yeah, so I'm back to just saying we need to shout about these things.
Aye, no, absolutely. Like there's 1,000 post offices or something going to get closed. Like it'd be good if they start closing the food banks.
Yeah, exactly. If there was no need for them, yeah.
What about, go back to the book, there's sort of talked about the sort of cuts to social care as well. Is it maybe worth sort of touching on some of that and how that has an impact on?
So it's so there's two main components to the austerity cuts. Talk quite a lot about social security and all the many different benefits that have been cut there and the impacts that had. And it's again important just to say that in one of the chapters, we lay out all the evidence in different groups showing how different cuts to different benefits impacted on health. Okay, but the other side of it is the cuts to basically local government funding, where local government funds lots of these services. And again, it's quite hard to overstate how important those services are for a civilised society, because it includes everything that the population relies on, from, you think of maybe kind of libraries and these kind of cultural services, and that's true, and they're important, but also housing services, and then you get into social care, you get into adult social care, child protection, you get into addiction services, so for a whole pile of different aspects of society, we rely on these services to help us. And the cuts there have been absolutely enormous. Absolutely enormous. The figures vary a lot. And so we present a number of figures. You may not have been awake at that point in the book, but we present a lot of figures. But, for example, in terms of total government expenditure cuts between 2010 and 2019, there's one estimate of about £500 billion. There's another estimate of in 1 year, 2019 compared to 2010, it's about £93 billion. And we very crudely and slightly ridiculously compare some of these figures to the GDP of entire countries. But that's basically on the scale that they're at. They're absolutely massive. So they've impacted on all these kind of services. But the other thing to say is that one feature of austerity is that the cuts have varied across different parts of the UK. And the kind of golden rule basically is, academics down south have looked at this in a lot of detail, but basically the areas that were already very poor are the ones that have been more hit the worst. So areas in the kind of north, kind of west of England, for example, which high levels of deprivation had the greatest cuts. Within Scotland, which actually wasn't quite as bad as England, but within Scotland, Glasgow had the greatest cuts. So it's the deprived areas that were already struggling that have had basically kind of twofold of cuts. So cuts to services, and then obviously in these poorer areas you have higher numbers of people needing help from the state anyway, so then they're impacted on again by cuts to social security. So it's a kind of double whammy in terms of that.
And you mentioned earlier, I don't know if we made it clear enough, so it's probably worth calling out, right? That some of the decisions were taken at UK level were mitigated by the devolved governments, but by doing that, that money then probably has to go for some other, area. So it's making it very difficult for the devolved administrations to manage their responsibilities, I suppose.
Yeah, so we don't talk too much about the devolved governments because this has been 99.9% recurring about the UK government. So as you mentioned, the Scottish government has tried to mitigate some aspects of this, and in fairness, the Scottish government, they've done other things more recently. So the Scottish Child Payment is an attempt to help poorer families. So yeah, that's there. I think you could also argue, we don't get into this in the book, but you could argue they could do a lot more. So, for example, various organisations, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, others have called out the need to increase that Scottish child payment if they're really going to make child poverty targets that they've set for themselves and that kind of stuff. So I think there is a lot more they can do. But this has been about the UK government. That's what austerity has been about. And as part of that, So the cuts to local services I was talking about were made directly from the UK government to local governments in England. In Scotland, it had to come through the devolved government, and there is some evidence from academics down south that kind of buffered it a little bit. So the effects were not quite so bad because they were able to kind of redistribute bits in their own budget here and there. But the bottom line is the money's been cut over, until the most recent budget, over 14 years. So it's impacted on society in England, it's impacted on society in Scotland, it's impacted across all of the UK.
I know that's important to mention. What about you? It seems like you've got some frustration with the media, David, the way you were talking earlier, so feel free to air that.
Well, you could do an entire podcast on my experiences with the media over the years in relation to this. Well, so we've talked quite a lot about awareness and lack of awareness and why that is, and we made a big effort with a couple of bits of work in my last job to get this out in the mainstream. So one of the journal papers that we published, which was that one about quantifying the numbers of deaths, more people died from this than from COVID, etc. We spent a lot of time with press releases and talking to journalists in advance. We had another report which was covering similar ground, and for that one we got advice in from people who work with the media to try and maximise the impact, and this person who was advising us spoke to lots of people in different organisations. And anyway, at the end of the day, for these bits of work, it was out there. So The Guardian, for example, picked this up, and then The Guardian tweeted to its own Twitter bubble. But they weren't really the people we were trying to reach. We were trying to reach the other side in terms of making people with power understand what was going on. And other than The Guardian and a few other outlets, there wasn't very much done. So, for example, a story I've given a few times in different places, we did speak to people in the BBC, kind of lunchtime bulletins type thing, but I recorded an interview with them, which was run on, I think, Report in Scotland. I never saw it. I think it was run on Report in Scotland at 6:30 in the morning. And by 7:30, apparently it had been replaced by a much more important story, which was about a college course for people keeping chickens. So I've been kind of telling the story sort of half laughing, but actually it kind of begs a lot of questions about why a story that was about government policies resulting in more deaths than the COVID pandemic didn't feature very much. So I'll let you think about why that might be without going into unfounded speculation.
Well, we've already done a podcast on BBC bias here at Galley Corner, so I'll leave. Sometimes it's better just to leave a wee bit of mystery. Folk can draw their own conclusions on that, I think. Is there anything else for the book, like any other accounts or like any other data you want to get across, David?
No, I think it's about the scale of it. I would just like to mention that, and this is also relevant to the kind of reach thing, is that we're not making money out of the book. So all royalties, current projections about £12.50, go to NHS charities. So what I've been doing in various presentations and various interviews and what have you is encouraging people to buy a copy of the book, but to send it to their MP. To try and, again, make people more aware of what's going on. So I would encourage anyone watching or listening this to do that.
Aye, or even if they can't afford it, then just send them the link to it as well. Would probably be sufficient.
Yeah.
I'm still waiting on a response from my local MP about another situation that's ongoing. So
there's a lot. That's funny. There's a lot of people waiting for responses from the local MPs. I had a conversation 3 times today. Well, the other thing is obviously about the importance of getting the message out there. It's not just about buying the book, but Jerry and I have been doing all sorts of excruciating videos and other podcasts.
I hope this isn't one of them, David. You're fucking going to kick you out here.
No. These are no. I'll send you the link and you can see how excruciating it is. No, we've been doing videos and podcasts and blogs and things like The Conversation, which kind of carries various kind of articles and all that. So there's lots of things out there where we've been talking about the book, and it sort of summarises the messages. And again, if people, I don't do social media, but if people are active in social media or are talking to their friends or whatever, and they don't want to share the whole book, they could share these summaries of the book to try and, again, make people a bit more aware of what's going on.
Aye. Like, if you had to summarise, like, you heard of this concept like an elevator pitch. So you meet somebody in the elevator, and by the time you get out, like, you're supposed to sort of know, like, what would be the sort of top 3 things that you, like, that we as, like, active citizens should know about, I suppose, with regards to life expectancy, why it's important, what the trend is, all that sort of stuff, if you can try and summarise it for us.
Okay. Is it quite a tall building? The elevator's going up for a long time.
Aye, there's 32 floors.
It's about life expectancy isn't just a measure of health, it's a measure of societal progress, okay? That's why it's gone up for so long, okay? It's a measure of how well we are doing as a society. So it shouldn't stop going up, and it certainly shouldn't go into the reverse. So when that happens, it's ringing all sorts of alarm bells that there's something profoundly wrong in the society we're in. It's the society we all live in, and we vote for the people who are in charge of the society. So understand these things, understand the evidence around all this, and get involved and shout about what's been happening, how society has changed, and shout about it as loud as you can to try and bring around some kind of positive change.
Perfect. What about, like, this came up in the book actually, so I think some politicians, and let's be honest, right, some of them just engage in a bit of spin. Like, this is ultimately why they're employed to do what they do, in my opinion. But the ones who are saying, like, life expectancy will just not continually to increase, like, if you see that, can you just email them and say, like, stop talking shite, basically? Like, there's a response to that.
So the two arguments. So the argument there is that life expectancy can't just keep going on up. Okay, well, there's 2 quick answers to that. The first, which is less important, is that actually, well, in countries where life expectancy still is higher, already, like Japan, it's still going up. So that counters that. But the more important one is that the biggest changes to life expectancy have been in poorer areas where life expectancy is nowhere near any kind of limit because people are dying a lot younger than the overall population. So that's a nonsensical argument, basically.
What is the life expectancy in Japan? Like, just the interest?
I have no idea.
Oh,
thanks, but thanks for asking. I could obviously, if I had, I could Google it in front of you and tell you, but I don't know. But it will be. It's higher than in the UK, basically. But the point is that it's continued on the same trajectory that previous trends predicted, whereas in the UK we stopped going up. Previous trends predicted us to keep going up, and it basically flatlined overall, but then, as I've said 100 times, gone into reverse in poorer areas.
And presumably Japan haven't been implementing any sort of...
So it's an important point. So one of the chapters of the book is about what happened in other countries, because actually in the aftermath of the financial crisis back in 2007, 2008, a lot of countries did implement austerity. But it's very hard to make comparisons because the types of austerity that were implemented were different in lots of countries. And also the context matters. So if you have a country which has a very strong welfare state, for example, it's in a better nick to deflect or mitigate the impact of austerity policies than a country where the welfare state is already threadbare, like, for example, the UK. So those comparisons are difficult. But Jerry, my co-author, in one of his Sundays, he was doing his 12th PhD or whatever he was doing at the time. He led a bit of really, really strong, important work, really robust statistical work where he used particular measures of austerity. So these are measures that are comparable across different countries. And he showed that across all high-income countries, wherever some form of austerity was implemented by the government, it had a detrimental impact on mortality rates. Or to translate that into English, it harmed the health of populations. So that's a really important part of the evidence, that although these things might differ and the context might differ, we know these policies are really bad for health.
And I think one of the countries that was cited as an example was Germany.
So that was So the point about Germany being highlighted was that this is a chapter looking at how these different organisations responded to the evidence, and also how the UK government responded to the evidence. And some of the ministers cited Germany as an example of where austerity had not been implemented, and yet there had also been changes to life expectancy. But what Jerry's analysis showed was that actually austerity policies had been implemented, and very openly they quote government ministers saying that we will following the pandemic, we'll be going back to austerity. So actually austerity was implemented, so that this was just untrue what they were saying.
Aye, and I think as well, one of the other things that is probably worth mentioning is, I forget the guy's name, you'll know, somebody Alston, I think, Terry Alston or something, is an Australian lawyer, and he was like the UN Special Raconteur. He was dispatched to the UK to investigate the impact of austerity, and he had some pretty strong...
Yeah, so Philip Alston was the UN, I forget his title now, but basically, Special Rapporteur for Poverty, I think. And he was, as you say, he was dispatched to the UK to see what was going on. That alone tells you an awful lot. That, you know, in the 21st century, the UK was singled out for somebody to go and find out what's going on. And he produced a report which was basically a reflection of everything we've talked about today in terms of the horrors on show in the UK. And he had a really strong quote, which is basically said, in a rich society, poverty is a political choice. You don't need to have it. You don't need to have poverty. The politicians have chosen to have poverty. And if they wanted to redress it, they could do it. But they choose to have poverty. And it was a really, really important report he did. It was completely dismissed by the government at the time. What a surprise. But I would encourage people to have a look at that, because it goes into detail of what he saw on his visit in terms of, again, the dependency on food banks, how the disabled were treated, what's been going on with mortality rates. And it's you know, it's important to remember, we talk a lot about life expectancy and mortality rates as these kind of ultimate measures, but, you know, there's a process to death, you know, so it's in terms of how all these things have impacted on mental health, on physical health, you know, before that point. It's just been devastating for, you know, incredible numbers of people, basically.
Aye, that's it. It's about quality of life as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you want to get all statistical, there's an indicator called healthy life expectancy. So that's a measure which is about not just how long you're living, but how long you're living in good health, because people deem that to be a kind of more sensitive measure, if you like. So in wealthy countries, that should go up and up and up and up and up. So we published a paper 2-3 years ago, which we were mentioning in the book, just showing that in Scotland, since austerity came in, it's been going down. I mean, it should never go down, it just shouldn't go down. And in the poorest parts of Scotland, so on average, these are people living in the 20% more deprived areas. People are only living on average in good health into their 40s. I mean, it's just unbelievable. You know, when does a statistic become a crisis or a scandal, you know?
Like, well, that should be it there. Like, surely to fuck. Like, if we live in a country where whatever the average life expectancy for them is supposed to be 82 or whatever, and people in our communities in this country, 40 odd year old, and then after that, their standard of living is deteriorating. That's tragic, actually.
It is, yeah.
Aye, I don't want to end on a downer though, David. So fucks. What about? It seems like you've had some like interest in the international community, and you've got a bugbear. They always seem to be intrigued about Scottish culinary choices. Is that right? Or they think that we only eat one item of food.
So that's part of my longer podcast about the media generally. But yeah, I've had a few interesting experiences. So there was a lot of work we did. A big report back in 2016. So this was all about what we refer to as excess mortality in Glasgow and Scotland. In relation to Glasgow, it's what the media likes to call a Glasgow effect, but we don't use that term because it's a kind of meaningless, unhelpful, nonsense term. But anyway, there was an article in The Guardian about higher mortality in Glasgow. This was based on some work we'd done. We were comparing with Liverpool and Manchester. And because it got in The Guardian, it attracted all sorts of international journalists to get in touch. So I had all sorts of bizarre and common encounters. But anyway, one of them was a journalist came over with a cameraman from Norway. It was like Norway's biggest selling tabloid, apparently. And anyway, she was completely obsessed by the idea that all of this poor health in Scotland at the time, this is going back a few years, and in Glasgow, was all explained by the deep-fried Mars bar. So I sat down with her for a good hour and a half or whatever and explained that, first of all, the deep-fried Mars bar is a bit of more myth than reality. Do you know, the most people that eat it tend to be journalists coming up to write a story about it, or tourists. I gave a talk to, it was one of my kids' schools, I think, actually, a good number of years ago, which is located in the south side and has a very, very mixed catchment area with a lot of kind of high levels of deprivation. And these were S4, S5 kids, I think. They were doing modern studies, can't remember now precisely. But there was a lot of them. It was a good, 100, whatever, 150 or something. And I said, how many of you have ever eaten a deep fried Mars bar? And not a single hand went up. So it's more myth than reality. But more at the point, I also sat down with her and said, in relation to this work, which was about comparing health in Scotland and England and in Glasgow and these other places, there have been big studies done where they take into account diet. They look at diet and they adjust for that. And this did not explain the differences in health. And also, some of the causes of death were around, where there were big differences, were around kind of drug-related death, which, as you know, is a big issue in Scotland. And I can go into that if you like, but it's a longer story. And things that was just nothing to do with diet. So, I kind of argued the case, and she nodded away, and it was all very nice and happy and all that, and then said, yeah, that's fine, I wouldn't mention that. And then they took a picture of me looking particularly grim, to say, and then they went round the corner to a chip shop and they asked the man to deep fry a Mars bar, and then we got sent, or a kind of comms colleague, communications colleague at work, got sent the link to the story, and it was basically a kind of 2-page thing in the middle of this tabloid, and on the left-hand side it had this grim picture of me saying, why do people in Scotland die younger than people in England? And then on the right-hand side it had a handy hint with a 3-step guide as to how to make a deep-fried Mars bar, as if that was the whole answer. So I don't know, what do you do? I'd explained this in quite a lot of detail, but clearly she was just intrigued by the whole idea of a deep fried Mars bar, and that was going to be the story, whatever. So
see, I think we like a good laugh in Scotland, but like things like that,
well, it's complete horseshit, let's be honest. I mean, it's just, and it also more seriously gets away from the importance of what's going on, and the importance of why things have been causing poor health, the importance of all the things we've been talking about. It's not about that, and it's just an unhelpful distraction.
Well, did I hope you responded and said, fuck off, you better not print it then, no?
I'm not very fluent in Norwegian, so.
See, that's what we need. We need more of that, I think. But no, is there anything else you want to talk about with regards to the book, or any other sort of health issues, David?
No, as I say, I would just encourage people to be aware of it, that we're not making money out of it, and if they can afford to buy the book, to send it to the MP, to do that. If not, to share some of the links that are around some of the podcasts and some of the summaries from blogs and all that. That would be great.
Aye, no, definitely. And if folk, I can send on the summary as well if they want. Just get in touch, callycorner@gmail.com. But I really appreciate you coming in today and explaining that, David.
Pleasure.
I hope everyone goes well with the book, and supporting things are doing, so fair play.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Cheers.